Hey guys, tonight we're venturing into a realm steeped in legend, a name that conjures images of noble knights, Camelot's gleaming towers, the mystical sword Excalibur, and a king who embodied chivalry and justice, Arthur Pendragon. For centuries, this Arthur, the once and future king, has captivated our imaginations, a beacon of light in a supposedly dark age. But tonight you are invited to pull back the shimmering tapestry of medieval romance, to look beyond the polished armor and the gallant quests. We're going to ask a rather uncomfortable question, one that might shatter a few cherished illusions. What if the King Arthur of legend, the paragon of virtue, is largely a beautiful, elaborate deception? What if the historical reality, if any Arthurian figure truly existed, was far grittier, far more brutal, and more akin to a desperate warlord clinging to power in a collapsing world than a fairy tale monarch? This journey won't be about dragons and damsels in distress, or the quest for the Holy Grail. Instead, you'll find yourself immersed in the harsh, unforgiving landscape of post-Roman Britain, a land grappling with the departure of imperial order, a land teetering on the brink of chaos. The reality check for tonight, the so-called Dark Ages of Britain, the 5th and 6th centuries AD, when Arthur supposedly lived, were no place for the faint of heart, and certainly no stage for the pristine chivalry later ascribed to him. To survive, let alone lead, in such a fractured, violent era, likely required a level of ruthlessness, pragmatism, and yes, brutality, that would make the romanticized Arthur blush, or perhaps draw his sword in disbelief at his own sanitized legend. You probably wouldn't recognize the man behind the myth, and frankly, his world would have been a terrifying place to endure. So, before you get comfortable, ready to challenge the gleaming image of Camelot, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And please, do drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where our fellow history explorers are joining from as we prepare to dissect this legendary deception. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We are not setting out to destroy a beloved legend entirely, but to peel back its layers, to sift through the historical and archaeological whispers, and to confront the possibility that the King Arthur we think we know might be one of history's most enduring and successful PR campaigns, masking a far more complex and likely far more brutal truth. Prepare to question the shining armor. There may be more rust and blood beneath it than the storytellers ever let on. Our quest tonight is to find the warlord obscured by the king, the harsh reality hidden by the comforting myth. To understand the kind of leader that might have truly existed in Arthurian Britain, you first have to immerse yourself in the sheer, unadulterated chaos that descended upon the island after the Roman legions packed their standards and sailed away for good. The year often cited is 410 AD, when the Romano-British officials were famously told by Emperor Honorius to look to their own defenses. Imagine that message arriving. For nearly 4 centuries, Britannia had been a province of the mighty Roman Empire. Its towns boasted baths, forums, and mosaic-floored villas. Its countryside was relatively ordered, crisscrossed by impressive Roman roads. Its defenses, particularly in the north, with Hadrian's Wall, and along the Saxon shore, were manned by the most formidable military machine the world had known. And then, almost overnight, that protection, that overarching imperial structure, simply vanished. You are living in Britain in the early 5th century. The news spreads, perhaps slowly at first, then with growing panic. The legions are not coming back. The Roman governor, the imperial administrators, the tax collectors, their authority is evaporating. What happens next is not a sudden, dramatic collapse into barbarism, as some older histories might have you believe, but a slow, agonizing unraveling, a descent into what historians now often term sub-Roman Britain, a period of profound uncertainty and transformation. The medical hardship here is societal. The body politic of Roman Britain is sick, its systems failing, and there's no clear physician to cure it. The towns, once vibrant centers of Roman life, begin a slow decline. Without the imperial economy to sustain them, without the regular influx of trade goods and official salaries, their sophisticated infrastructure, the aqueducts, the sewers, the public buildings, falls into disrepair. You might see grass growing in the forum of what was once a bustling civitas capital. Grand stone villas in the countryside, with their underfloor heating and beautiful mosaics, are gradually abandoned, or their use changes dramatically. Some are crudely subdivided, their once elegant rooms now housing multiple families or even livestock, their owners unable to maintain the lavish lifestyle of their forebears, or perhaps having fled in search of greater security. The shocking secret isn't that civilization ended, but that it slowly, painfully, and petagely transformed into something else, something far more localized and precarious. The intricate network of Roman roads, a marvel of engineering, begins to suffer from neglect. Without centralized maintenance, they become rutted, overgrown, and increasingly dangerous to travel. Trade, which once flowed relatively freely under Roman protection, becomes more localized, more hazardous. The use of coinage declines sharply, replaced by barter or systems of tribute and obligation. Law and order, once enforced by Roman magistrates and military power, becomes a far more uncertain proposition. Local strongmen, ambitious tribal chieftains, or perhaps former Romano-British military commanders, begin to carve out their own little fiefdoms, their authority based not on imperial decree, but on the strength of their arms and the loyalty of their personal warbands. One quirky tidbit that archaeologists sometimes find is evidence of wealthy Romano-Britons desperately trying to cling to the old ways. They might hoard Roman coins, now useless as currency but perhaps treasured as symbols of a lost golden age. They might continue to use Latin in inscriptions, even as the spoken language around them evolves. But these are the exceptions. For most, life becomes a daily struggle for security and sustenance in a world where the old rules no longer apply. The human endurance of just getting by, of adapting to this new fragmented reality, is immense. This is the crucible in which any Arthur figure would have been forged. Not an era of glittering courts and chivalric quests, but a time of profound insecurity, crumbling infrastructure, and the desperate scramble for power in the long, fading shadow of a fallen eagle. The Arthur you likely picture in your mind's eye, the noble king in shining plate armor, presiding over the knights of the Round Table in a magnificent Camelot, pulling Excalibur from a stone or receiving it from the Lady of the Lake, is largely a product of much later centuries, specifically the High and Late Middle Ages. This romantic, chivalric figure, so central to Western literature and imagination, was meticulously forged, not in the smithies of Dark Age Britain, but in the fertile imaginations of medieval poets, chroniclers, and romance writers. Understanding this deception, or rather this elaborate literary construction, is key to searching for any historical kernel that might lie beneath. The earliest, wispiest references to a figure named Arthur, or someone like him, come from much earlier, more shadowy sources. The Welsh monk Gildas, writing in the 6th century, speaks of a great British victory against the Saxons at a place called Mons Badonicus, Mount Baden, but he frustratingly doesn't name the British leader. Later, the 9th century Welsh historian Nennius, in his Historia Britonum, explicitly lists Arthur as the Dux Bellorum, leader of battles or warlord, who led the Britons in 12 victories against the Saxons, culminating in Baden. Nennius's Arthur is a fierce, almost superhuman warrior, not yet a king of a grand court, but a formidable military commander. This is perhaps the closest we get to a Dark Age Arthur, if he existed. However, the real explosion of the Arthurian legend, the one that gave us Camelot, Lancelot, Guinevere, the Grail quest, and the whole chivalric ethos, begins in the 12th century with Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britannia, History of the Kings of Britain. This highly imaginative and largely fictional work presented Arthur as a mighty king who not only united Britain, but conquered much of Europe. Geoffrey, writing in a period of Norman rule in England, was arguably crafting a glorious, unifying national myth for Britain, one that could stand alongside the epics of Charlemagne or Alexander the Great. You can almost see him, quill in hand, embellishing vague traditions with grand new details, creating a king for all seasons. Then, in the late 12th and 13th centuries, French romance writers like Chrétien de Troyes took Geoffrey's Arthurian framework and infused it with the ideals of courtly love, knightly chivalry, and mystical quests. It was Chrétien who introduced Lancelot and his adulterous love for Guinevere, the quest for the Holy Grail, and the focus on individual knights and their adventures. Arthur himself often recedes into the background in these romances, becoming more of a presiding figure over a court of legendary heroes. The medical hardship here is for historical accuracy. The original gritty context of post-Roman Britain is almost entirely buried under layers of romantic invention. Finally, in the 15th century, Sir Thomas Malory, writing Le Morte d'Arthur while imprisoned, synthesized these various French and English traditions into the epic, tragic narrative that has become the most influential version of the Arthurian legend in the English-speaking world. Malory's work, full of heroism, betrayal, love, and loss, solidified the image of Arthur as the tragic hero, the once and future king. One quirky tidbit is that Malory himself was a rather unchivalrous character, accused of various crimes including theft, rape, and attempted murder, a stark contrast to the noble ideals he wrote about. The scholarly debate is endless. Was Geoffrey of Monmouth drawing on genuine, lost Welsh traditions, or was he largely inventing his grand narrative? To what extent did political motivations, Norman, English, Welsh, Breton, shape the development of the legend? What is clear is that each era reimagined Arthur in its own image, for its own purposes. The shocking secret, if you will, is how little the glittering edifice of medieval Arthurian romance likely resembles any historical reality of 5th or 6th century Britain. To find a more plausible, brutal, Dark Age warlord, we must strip away these centuries of literary polish to truly understand the kind of figure an Arthur would have needed to be in post-Roman Britain. you must first confront the grim, unvarnished reality of the era, often, if somewhat pejoratively, termed the Dark Ages. While modern historians rightly caution against viewing this period, roughly 5th to 8th centuries AD in Britain, as a complete societal collapse devoid of any culture or order, it was undeniably a time of profound disruption, widespread violence, economic decline, and immense human endurance in the face of constant uncertainty. The shining Camelot of legend simply has no place here. Imagine yourself a simple farmer or villager in the 5th or 6th century Britain. The Roman legions, the guarantors of peace, the Pax Romana for generations, are gone. The sophisticated infrastructure they built, roads, towns, villas, is crumbling from neglect. Centralized authority has fragmented. In its place, a patchwork of petty kingdoms and local warlords emerges, each vying for territory, resources, and a fragile dominance. Life for you becomes incredibly precarious. Violence is no longer a distant threat on the frontiers of the empire. It is an ever-present reality in your own backyard. Raiding parties from neighboring British groups, from Picts and Scots invading from the north, or increasingly from Anglo-Saxon warrior bands arriving from across the North Sea, become a constant menace. You live in a small, perhaps fortified village. Your home is likely a simple timber and thatch structure, a far cry from a Roman villa. Each day is a struggle for sustenance. Agriculture is less organized, trade routes disrupted. Famine and disease are frequent visitors. The medical hardship is immense. Without Roman sanitation systems or access to even their level of medical knowledge, however limited by our standards, common illnesses become deadly. Infant and child mortality rates are tragically high. A simple infected wound, a broken bone, a difficult childbirth. These are often death sentences. There are no hospitals, no trained surgeons in the Roman mold. Healing, if it comes, is through folk remedies, herbal concoctions, and perhaps the intervention of a local wise woman or a Christian priest, as Christianity, though struggling, did survive in parts of Britain. The gory history of this period isn't just in the pitched battles between warlords, but in the brutal, everyday realities. Imagine your village being attacked. It's a scene of terror, raiders storming through, an orgy of looting, burning, killing, and enslavement. There are no Geneva Conventions here, no rules of engagement beyond the stark calculus of power and survival. Women and children are particularly vulnerable. The archaeological record from this period sometimes reveals settlements violently destroyed, their inhabitants massacred, or evidence of defensive structures hastily erected and then overwhelmed. One quirky, or rather sobering detail, is the resurgence of older pre-Roman cultural practices and beliefs. In some areas, as Roman influence waned, this wasn't necessarily a regression, but an adaptation, a reassertion of local identities in a changed world. The scholarly debate continues on the extent of societal collapse versus continuity. Some regions, particularly in the west and north, may have maintained a stronger degree of Romano-British identity and order for longer, while others in the east and south experienced more profound disruption and the relatively rapid emergence of Anglo-Saxon culture and power. But nowhere was untouched by the general decline in security, trade, and centralized governance. This is the brutal, unforgiving stage upon which any historical Arthur would have had to play his part. A world demanding not chivalry and romance, but cunning, strength, and a capacity for ruthless action just to survive. let alone to lead. In the chaotic, fragmented landscape of post-Roman Britain, the old Roman legal structures and chains of command have dissolved. What rises in their place? Not a unified kingdom led by a chivalrous king, but a patchwork of competing territories controlled by local strongmen, ambitious chieftains, and pragmatic war leaders. The figures we might, without the romantic gloss, call warlords. To understand the world of any potential historical Arthur, you must first understand the brutal, unwritten code by which these Dark Age power brokers lived and died. Might makes right. Imagine yourself as one of these aspiring leaders, or perhaps a warrior in their retinue. Your authority doesn't come from an imperial edict or a hereditary line sanctioned by ancient law. It comes from the sharp edge of your sword, the loyalty of your comitatus, your personal warband, and your ability to provide them with plunder, land, and a measure of security against other rival warlords. It's a world of raw power politics, where alliances are shifting and treacherous, and where your neighbor today could be your mortal enemy tomorrow. The human endurance required is not just physical, but also a constant mental game of vigilance and calculation. The core of your power is your warband, a group of warriors bound to you by oaths of loyalty, but also, more practically, by the promise of reward. You must keep them fed, armed, and satisfied with the spoils of war. This means frequent raiding, not just against external enemies like encroaching Saxons or neighboring British chieftains, but potentially against any weaker group whose resources you covet. There's no concept of just war in the later medieval sense. Survival and the aggrandizement of your power are the primary justifications. You lead your warriors from the front, your personal courage and martial prowess essential for maintaining their respect and loyalty. A warlord who shows weakness or indecision, or who fails to deliver victory and plunder, will quickly find his followers deserting him, or worse, turning against him. Medical hardship is a constant companion. Battle wounds are frequent and often severe. As a leader, you might bear many scars. There's no sophisticated field surgery. You rely on the rough and ready skills of your warriors, or perhaps a local healer to staunch bleeding, extract arrowheads and bind wounds, often with a high risk of infection and a slow, agonizing recovery, if you recover at all. A serious injury could mean the end of your leadership, as a weakened warlord is a vulnerable one. Discipline within your territory is maintained not by complex laws, but by swift, often brutal justice. Betrayal is met with death. Theft or insubordination is punished harshly to make an example. Your word is law, but it's a law backed by force. One quirky, or perhaps grimly pragmatic aspect of this warlord's code is that loyalty is often a very fluid concept. Warriors might switch allegiance if a rival leader offers better prospects or demonstrates greater strength. Your ability to inspire fear in your enemies and command the unwavering loyalty of your followers through a combination of charisma, success in battle, and a reputation for both generosity to friends and ruthlessness to foes is paramount. The scholarly debate often considers the nature of these post-Roman power structures. Were they purely opportunistic and predatory, or did some warlords also see themselves as protectors of their local communities, maintaining a semblance of order and defense in a collapsing world? Likely, it was a mixture of both. But the shocking secret for anyone expecting a proto-chivalric Arthur is that the dominant ethos was one of brutal pragmatism. To survive and thrive as a leader in Dark Age Britain, you couldn't afford to be a saint or a philosopher king. You had to be a warrior, first and foremost, willing to do whatever it took to secure your power and protect your people, operating under a code where the only true authority was the strength of your sword arm. Forget the gleaming plate armor, the jousting lances, and the meticulously planned sieges of later medieval romance. Warfare in the 5th and 6th century Britain, the supposed era of King Arthur, was a far more brutal, chaotic, and intimate affair. As you, the observer, try to peel back the layers of legend, the shocking secret you uncover is that the battlefields of the Dark Ages were bloody, muddy, and terrifyingly personal, fought by men in simple gear, with relatively primitive, yet brutally effective weapons. Imagine yourself as a warrior in a typical Dark Age warband, perhaps following a local chieftain who might one day be called Arthur. Your armor, if you have any, is likely a thick leather jerkin or perhaps a padded tunic. Only the wealthiest leaders or elite warriors might possess a mail shirt, byrnie, a costly and labor-intensive piece of equipment. Most warriors fought with little more than their courage and a sturdy shield, typically round or sometimes kite-shaped, made of wood covered with leather, perhaps with a central iron boss to deflect blows and protect the hand. There's no shining plate here, no elaborate heraldry, just practical, often well-worn, gear designed for a harsh reality. The medical hardship begins before the battle even starts. Just enduring the elements and such basic equipment would be a test. The weapons are equally stark. The primary weapon for many is the spear, used for both thrusting and throwing. It's relatively cheap to produce, with a simple iron head on a wooden shaft. Swords, particularly long, well-made ones, are more prestigious, symbols of status and wealth, often passed down through generations or taken as prized plunder. These are typically straight, double-edged blades, designed for cutting and slashing. The famous Excalibur, if it had a real-world counterpart, would have been an exceptionally rare and valuable weapon. More common, perhaps, were shorter swords or long knives, axes, useful in the close confines of a shield wall. And of course, there was the axe, the fearsome throwing axe or the heavier battle axe, capable of cleaving through shields and helmets with terrifying force. Bows and arrows were also used, though perhaps more for skirmishing or hunting than as a decisive battlefield weapon in the way the English longbow would later become. The gory history of a Dark Age battle is visceral. Tactics often revolved around the shield wall, warriors packed tightly together, their shields interlocked, creating a formidable defensive line. Battles would often begin with an exchange of missiles, spears, javelins, arrows, even stones. Then the shield walls would clash, a brutal, pushing, shoving match, punctuated by the desperate thrusts of spears and the hacking of axes and swords through any gap in the enemy line. It's a maelstrom of noise, war cries, the clang of weapon on shield, the screams of the wounded. Casualties would be horrific. Wounds were often devastating. Deep gashes, shattered bones, pierced organs. One quirky, or rather grimly practical aspect of Dark Age warfare was its often seasonal nature. Campaigns might be limited by the need to sow or harvest crops. Raiding was a common form of conflict. Swift, brutal incursions into enemy territory to seize cattle, grain, slaves, and other plunder, often involving the burning of villages and the massacre of those who resisted. This wasn't about chivalrous encounters between nobles. It was about survival, resource acquisition, and the brutal assertion of dominance. The scholarly debate often considers the scale of these battles. While some, like the semi-legendary Mount Baden, might have been larger engagements, many were likely smaller, more localized affairs between rival chieftains or war bands. But even a small battle fought with such brutal intimacy would have been a terrifying and bloody experience, a far cry from the romanticized tournaments of later Arthurian legend. You're a warrior in Dark Age Britain, perhaps fighting alongside a chief who inspires a fierce loyalty, a figure later storytellers might call Arthur. The battle was a brutal, close-quarters affair, a chaotic storm of spear thrusts, axe blows, and the desperate clash of shields. Miraculously, you've survived the initial onslaught, but not unscathed. A spear has gashed your leg, or an axe has glanced off your shield and laid open your arm. Now, as the frenzy of combat subsides, you face a new, perhaps even more terrifying, enemy. Infection, blood loss, and the horrifying inadequacy of battlefield medicine in this era. The shocking secret here is the almost complete lack of what we would recognize as effective medical care. There are no field surgeons in white tents, no sterile instruments, no antibiotics, no morphine to dull the agonizing pain. If you are seriously wounded, your chances of survival are grim. Your comrades might drag you from the field, but their ability to help is severely limited. The first medical hardship is simply staunching the bleeding. This might involve the pressing moss or cobwebs, both of which have some traditional, if unreliable, hemostatic properties into the wound, or perhaps even the brutal, desperate measure of cauterizing a severe bleeder with a heated piece of metal, an act of unimaginable agony in itself, and one that often led to deeper tissue damage and infection. If a bone is broken, it might be crudely set and splinted with branches and strips of leather or cloth, but with no understanding of proper alignment or immobilization. The chances of it healing correctly are slim. You might be left with a permanent, crippling deformity. If an arrowhead or spear tip is embedded deep in muscle or bone, extracting it without causing further damage or introducing massive infection is a near impossibility with the tools available, perhaps just a knife point and a prayer. The gory history continues long after the weapons are silenced, in the festering wounds and the slow, agonizing deaths from sepsis or gangrene. Herbal remedies would have been the mainstay of any attempted treatment. Certain plants were known for their supposed healing properties. Yarrow to staunch bleeding, plantain as an anti-inflammatory, comfrey or knitbone for fractures. Women in the community, or perhaps a local wise woman or healer, who might later be demonized in Christian times as a witch or revered as a cunning woman, would possess this traditional knowledge. They would prepare poultices, infusions, or salves. While some of these herbs do indeed have mild antiseptic or analgesic properties, their effectiveness against the severe trauma and rampant bacteria of a battlefield wound was minimal. You can almost smell the strange, earthy aroma of these concoctions, a mixture of hope and often futility. One quirky, or perhaps deeply pragmatic aspect of this era's battlefield medicine was the understanding that some wounds were simply beyond any available treatment. For a warrior with a deep abdominal wound or a shattered skull, little could be done except perhaps to offer water, some words of comfort, or a ritual to ease their passing into the next world. The scholarly debate often explores the extent to which pre-Christian beliefs about healing, magic, and the intervention of gods or spirits played a role in how wounds were perceived and treated? Was recovery seen as a sign of divine favor, or the efficacy of a particular ritual as much as any physical remedy? The human endurance of those who did survive such injuries, often bearing horrific scars and lifelong disabilities, is a testament to the sheer resilience of the human body, but also to the brutal lottery of survival in an age where a simple cut could be a death sentence. The battlefield was not just a place of valor, it was a gateway to immense suffering and a very lonely death if your luck ran out. The glittering edifice of Arthurian romance, with its chivalrous knights and mystical quests, stands in stark contrast to the grim reality of 5th and 6th century Britain you've been exploring. So, if the legendary King Arthur of Camelot is largely a medieval fiction, was there any historical figure, any brutal Dark Age warlord, who might have provided the original spark, the tiny kernel of truth around which these later myths crystallized? As you, the seeker of historical reality, delve into this question, you find a landscape littered with intriguing candidates, tantalizing clues, and frustratingly, a profound lack of definitive proof. The shocking secret might be that the real Arthur, if he existed, was far more obscure and less singular than the legend suggests. The earliest sources to mention a figure named Arthur, or an Arthur-like leader, are, as we've noted, frustratingly vague. Gildas, writing in the 6th century, speaks of a major British victory over the Saxons at the Battle of Mount Badon, Mons Badonicus, around the year 500 AD, which halted Saxon expansion for a generation. Crucially, Gildas doesn't name the British commander. It was Nennius, in his 9th century Historia Brittonum, who first explicitly links Arthur to this victory and credits him with a string of 12 successful battles as a dux bellorum, a leader of battles or warlord, not necessarily a king. This Nennian Arthur is a fierce warrior, a Christian fighting pagan Saxons, but still a shadowy figure. So, who could this warlord have been? Several historical or semi-historical figures from the period have been proposed by scholars as potential candidates, though the evidence for each is debated. One prominent name is Ambrosius Aurelianus. Gildas does mention Ambrosius as a Roman-descended leader who rallied the Britons and achieved some victories against the Saxons before the Battle of Badon. He's described as a man of modest and noble character, perhaps the last of the Romans. Could Arthur have been one of his commanders, or a later figure who took up his mantle, his deeds eventually becoming conflated with Ambrosius's own? It's a plausible theory, and Ambrosius is one of the few figures from this period with a contemporary historical attestation. Another intriguing, though more controversial candidate is Riothamus, a king of the Britons, or perhaps Bretons from Marmorica, Brittany, who, according to the 6th century Gothic historian Jordanes and other sources, led an army from Britain to Gaul in the 460s AD to fight alongside the Romans against the Visigoths. He was eventually defeated and disappeared from history. Some scholars have tried to link Riothamus to Arthur, suggesting his campaigns in Gaul were the basis for Arthur's later legendary European conquests, described by Geoffrey of Monmouth. The medical hardship of leading an army on such a distant, ultimately doomed campaign would have been immense. Then there's the possibility that Arthur was not a single individual, but a title, a nickname, perhaps derived from the Welsh Arth, meaning bear, a symbol of warrior strength, or even a composite figure, his legend amalgamating the deeds of several different local chieftains and war leaders who resisted the Anglo-Saxon advance in various parts of Britain. In the fragmented, localized power structures of post-Roman Britain, there were likely many such figures. Romano-British aristocrats, Celtic tribal leaders, or ambitious warriors, carving out their own domains, fighting for survival and dominance. One quirky tidbit: the name Arthurius, is a Roman family name, suggesting that if there was a historical Arthur, he might have come from a background with Roman connections, trying to uphold some semblance of Roman order or identity. The scholarly debate is fierce and ongoing. Some historians are deeply skeptical, arguing there is no reliable contemporary evidence for a historical Arthur, and that he is entirely a product of later legend-making. Others believe that while the romantic embellishments are fiction, there must have been a genuine, significant British war leader in the late 5th or early 6th century, whose memory, however distorted, survived in oral tradition. The shocking secret for many Arthurian enthusiasts is that even if a real Arthur existed, he would have been a product of his brutal times, a hard-bitten pragmatic warlord focused on survival and power, not a king concerned with chivalric codes that wouldn't be invented for another 6 or 7 centuries. His story, if we could recover it, would likely be one of gory history and desperate human endurance, not shining armor and magical swords. You've grappled with the possibility that the historical Arthur, if he existed at all, was likely a pragmatic Dark Age warlord, rather than the chivalrous king of medieval romance. Now, let's extend that reality check to his legendary court and stronghold, Camelot. The name itself evokes images of towering white turrets, splendid halls filled with noble knights and fair ladies, a beacon of justice and learning in a benighted age. But if you were to step into the Camelot of a 5th or 6th century British warlord, the shocking secret you'd uncover is a far cry from this glittering fairy tale. It would be less stone castle, more reoccupied Iron Age hill fort, its splendor measured in defensibility and stored grain rather than tapestries and ornaments. Imagine the landscape of post-Roman Britain. Grand Roman cities and villas are in decline, their stone often being repurposed for more modest, defensible structures. In this era of instability and localized warfare, the most practical and strategically important sites were often ancient hill forts. Those massive earthwork enclosures built by Iron Age tribes centuries before the Romans arrived. These sites, typically occupying dominant hilltop positions with clear views of the surrounding countryside, offered natural defensive advantages. Archaeologists have found evidence that many of these hill forts, long abandoned during the Pax Romana, were reoccupied and refortified during the sub-Roman period. This is where a pragmatic warlord, an Arthur figure, would likely establish his power base. So, what would this Dark Age Camelot look like? Forget polished stone and soaring spires. You'd find formidable earthen ramparts, perhaps topped with a newly rebuilt timber palisade, sharp stakes pointing outwards. Inside these defenses, the halls would be large timber structures, their roofs thatched with straw or reeds, the interiors smoky from open hearths. These wouldn't be grand feasting halls for elaborate chivalric rituals, but communal living spaces, armories and storehouses, bustling with the rough and ready activity of a warband and its dependents. The medical hardship would be ever-present. Cramped, smoky living conditions would exacerbate respiratory problems, and sanitation would be rudimentary at best. The knights of this Camelot would be the warlord's comitatus, his household warriors, bound to him by oaths and the promise of plunder. They'd be tough, seasoned fighters, their gear practical and well-used, not ceremonial. Their round-table discussions would be less about courtly love and more about scouting reports, planned raids, the loyalty of neighboring chieftains, and the ever-pressing need for food and supplies to sustain the fort. You, perhaps, as a young warrior or a laborer within the fort, would experience a life of constant vigilance. The threat of attack would be ever-present. Days would be filled with training, repairing defenses, tending to livestock, and farming the lands controlled by your chieftain. One quirky tidbit: Cadbury Castle in Somerset, a massive Iron Age hill fort with evidence of significant refortification and occupation during the 5th to 6th centuries, including a large timber hall and imported Mediterranean pottery, suggesting a high-status occupant, has long been popularly associated with Camelot, partly due to local tradition and the writings of the 16th century antiquarian John Leland. While archaeologists are cautious about direct links to a specific Arthur, sites like Cadbury provide a vivid picture of what a major Dark Age power center might have looked like. It was a place of strength, yes, but also of grim necessity, its grandeur rooted in its ability to protect its inhabitants and project its leader's power in a dangerous world. The shocking secret of a warlord's Camelot is its stark functionality, a fortified camp designed for survival and dominance, a world away from the glittering courts of romantic legend. You are now immersed in the gritty reality of a Dark Age British stronghold, the Camelot of a pragmatic warlord, perhaps the historical figure later mythologized as Arthur. The shocking secret you're beginning to grasp is that power in this era was not maintained through noble pronouncements or chivalrous deeds, but through a relentless series of hard, often ruthless decisions. To hold on to his precarious authority, to feed his warband, and to protect his territory from rivals and invaders, your warlord leader would have had to be capable of acts that the romanticized Arthur would find abhorrent. Imagine a council of war within the smoky timber hall. Scouts have brought news. A neighboring chieftain is encroaching on your grazing lands, or a Saxon raiding party has been spotted nearby. What is to be done? There's no room for indecision. Your leader must act swiftly and decisively. This might mean launching a preemptive strike, a brutal raid to eliminate the threat, seize plunder, and make an example of his enemies. Casualties are expected, both yours and theirs. The gory history of this period is written in such bloody encounters. There are no negotiations for surrender based on honor. It's often a fight to the death, or to enslavement for the vanquished. What about internal threats? Loyalty in a warband was often bought with success and maintained by fear as much as by affection. If a warrior or a subordinate chieftain in your leader's retinue shows signs of disloyalty, or if they challenge his authority, the response would have to be swift and brutal. Public execution, perhaps by beheading or hanging, would serve as a stark warning to others. There's no concept of a fair trial by a jury of peers. The warlord's judgment, however harsh, is final. The medical hardship here is the ever-present threat of violence, not just from external foes, but from within your own ranks if the delicate balance of power shifts. Resources are scarce. Your warlord needs to feed his warriors, their families, and the other inhabitants of his fort. This means exacting tribute in grain, cattle, or other goods from the farming communities under his control. If a village fails to provide its quota, perhaps due to a poor harvest or their own desperation, what then? Your leader might be forced to take what he needs by force, even from his own people, to prevent his warband from starving or deserting him. This is the grim calculus of survival, the human endurance of the common folk, caught between the demands of their warlord and the harshness of the times, is immense. One quirky, or rather chillingly pragmatic aspect of a warlord's power was the use of terror as a political tool, a reputation for ruthlessness, for inflicting terrible vengeance on enemies, could be a powerful deterrent, keeping potential rivals at bay and ensuring the grudging obedience of subjugated populations. This doesn't mean your leader was necessarily a sadist, though some undoubtedly were, but that he understood the brutal necessities of maintaining control in a world where weakness was an invitation to disaster. The scholarly debate often considers whether such necessary brutality contributed to the later legends of a strong, decisive, if ultimately tragic leader like Arthur. The shocking secret is that the price of power in Dark Age Britain was often paid in blood, betrayal, and broken oaths. Your warlord leader, to be successful, to carve out a domain and hold it against all comers, would have had to navigate a treacherous world of shifting alliances, make agonizing choices with limited information, and be prepared to act with a level of ruthlessness that sits uneasily with our modern notions of heroism. The noble savage or the chivalrous knight are anachronisms here. The reality was far more complex and far more brutal. The legend of King Arthur is inextricably linked with the Knights of the Round Table, a fellowship of the noblest warriors in Christendom, bound by oaths of chivalry, embarking on quests for honor and divine grace, and seated as equals around a symbolic table. But as you continue to peel back the layers of medieval romance, to find the gritty reality of a Dark Age Warlord's Britain, the shocking secret about any round table equivalent becomes starkly clear. It would have been a council of hard-bitten, pragmatic warriors, their loyalty forged in battle and self-interest, their discussions focused on brutal necessity rather than courtly ideals. Imagine your warlord leader, this proto-Arthur, gathering his most trusted commanders and veteran warriors. They don't meet in a grand, tapestried hall, but perhaps in the smoky main timber hall of his hill fort, or even around a campfire on campaign. There's no polished oak table here. If there's a table at all, it might be a rough-hewn plank, or perhaps they simply sit in a circle on benches or furs. The equality symbolized by the legendary Round Table is also unlikely. While your leader would value the counsel of his experienced warriors, the hierarchy would be clear. He is the dux bellorum, the war leader, and his word is ultimately law. However, a wise warlord listens to his men, especially those whose skill in battle and loyalty are proven. Who are these knights? They are not the idealized figures of later romance, clad in shining armor, spouting poetry, and rescuing damsels. They are seasoned fighters, their faces scarred, their bodies bearing the marks of countless skirmishes. They are loyal to your leader because he provides them with leadership, with the opportunity for plunder, a crucial motivator for warriors in this era, and with a share of any land or tribute gained. Their chivalry is a warrior's code of a different sort, loyalty to their comrades in arms, courage in battle, and perhaps a grim adherence to oaths sworn. but not necessarily mercy to defeated enemies or protection for the weak beyond their own kin or dependents. The medical hardship for these men is the constant risk of injury or death, their bodies testament to the brutal nature of their profession. What do they discuss at their councils? Not the quest for the Holy Grail or the finer points of courtly love. Their talk is of war, survival, and power. Scouts report Saxon warbands moving up the valley. Do we ambush them or fortify our position? The harvest in the western villages was poor. How much grain can we demand as tribute without provoking a rebellion? Chieftain X of the neighboring territory has been making overtures to our rivals. Is he a threat? And how do we neutralize him? Where can we raid next to secure more cattle and metalwork to reward our warriors? These are the brutal pragmatic questions that would dominate their round table. The gory history is planned here, the strategies for survival and dominance debated. One quirky or perhaps telling detail from early Welsh poetry and chronicles, sources that, while later than the 5th to 6th centuries, might preserve older traditions, is the emphasis on the heroic feasting and drinking in a chieftain's hall, where warriors would boast of their deeds and pledge their loyalty in exchange for gifts and sustenance. This mead hall culture, with its boisterous camaraderie and fierce loyalties, is perhaps a more accurate reflection of a Dark Age warlord's court than the refined atmosphere of Camelot. The scholarly debate often considers how much of this warrior hall ethos survived from Celtic or Germanic traditions into the sub-Roman period. The shocking secret of Arthur's Round Table is that it was likely a far cry from the noble fellowship of legend, more akin to a pragmatic war council of a chieftain and his toughest retainers, their unity forged not by abstract ideals, but by shared danger and the grim necessities of a violent age. The backdrop to any story of a 5th or 6th century British warlord, the proto-Arthur figure you are now envisaging, is the relentless, escalating pressure from Anglo-Saxon groups migrating and settling in eastern and southern Britain. These were not unified invasions in the Roman sense, at least not initially, but a complex process of infiltration, settlement, and conflict that gradually transformed the face of the island. So, how would your pragmatic, brutal, Dark Age warlord deal with this existential threat? The shocking secret is that his response would likely be a messy, opportunistic mix of bloody warfare, grudging negotiation, and perhaps even temporary, treacherous alliances. Whatever it took to survive and maintain his own precarious power. Forget the legends of Arthur single-handedly driving all Saxons from Britain in a series of glorious victories. The reality was far more fragmented and desperate. Your warlord, based perhaps in the west or north, would be facing an enemy that was not a monolithic force, but a collection of different Germanic tribal groups, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, each with their own leaders, agendas, and levels of aggression. Some might be seeking land for settlement, others primarily interested in raiding and plunder. Your leader's strategy would have to be flexible and reactive. There would undoubtedly be periods of intense, gory warfare. If Saxon warbands encroached upon his territory or threatened communities under his protection, your warlord would have no choice but to meet force with force. This is where battles like the semi-legendary Mount Badon, if it truly happened, and if an Arthur figure led the Britons, fit in. A significant British victory that, according to Gildas and Nennius, temporarily halted the Saxon advance. You can imagine the brutal shield wall clashes, the desperate defense of hill forts, the medical hardship of countless casualties on both sides. Victory would bring a temporary reprieve, perhaps some plunder, and enhance your leader's reputation. Defeat could mean the loss of territory, the slaughter or enslavement of his people, and the end of his own rule. However, constant, all-out war was rarely sustainable for these small, resource-strapped Dark Age kingdoms. So, your warlord might also resort to other, less heroic strategies. Negotiation, however fraught with mistrust, might occur. Perhaps a boundary could be agreed upon, or a temporary truce established. Tribute might be paid, by either side depending on who currently held the upper hand. A grim recognition of military reality. There's even the possibility, hinted at in some interpretations of the sources, that British chieftains sometimes hired Saxon warrior bands as mercenaries to fight against their British rivals. A dangerous game that often backfired when the mercenaries turned on their employers. The human endurance here is not just in fighting, but in navigating these treacherous political waters. One quirky detail is the archaeological evidence in some early Anglo-Saxon graves of high-status goods that appear to be of British or Romano-British origin, suggesting complex interactions that went beyond simple conquest, perhaps trade, gift exchange, or the assimilation of British individuals into Saxon society, or vice versa in some very early instances. The scholarly debate is intense regarding the nature of the Anglo-Saxon settlement. Was it primarily violent conquest and displacement of the native Britons, or a more complex process of migration, acculturation, and elite dominance, with varying degrees of interaction and conflict in different regions? The shocking secret for those who imagine Arthur as an unwavering, racially pure champion against a monolithic Saxon foe is that the reality was likely a murky, shifting landscape of conflict, coexistence, and pragmatic deal-making. Your brutal Dark Age warlord, to survive, would have had to be a master of all these strategies, a fierce warrior when necessary, a canny negotiator when possible, and perhaps even a treacherous opportunist if it served his interests. His primary goal was not the abstract salvation of Britain, but the survival and dominance of his own people and his own power base in a world rapidly and often violently changing. No tale of King Arthur, however revisionist, feels complete without acknowledging his enigmatic mentor, the powerful magician Merlin. In the legends, Merlin is the master of arcane knowledge, the shaper of destinies, the one who orchestrates Arthur's birth, his rise to power, and provides him with magical aid like the sword Excalibur. But as you strip away the medieval romanticism and place yourself in the gritty reality of a 5th or 6th century British warlord's court, what kind of Merlin figure might you realistically find? The shocking secret is that any such advisor would likely be less a wizard of fairy tale and more a canny shaman, a politically astute druidic survivor, or even a carefully constructed part of your warlord leader's own propaganda machine. Imagine your Dark Age proto-Arthur. He needs more than just loyal warriors. He needs wisdom, foresight, or the appearance of it, and a way to bolster his authority and mystique among a superstitious populace. In a world where Christianity was still vying with older pagan beliefs, and where the veil between the natural and supernatural was perceived as thin, a figure who could interpret omens, perform rituals, offer seemingly profound advice, or even claim access to hidden knowledge would be incredibly valuable. This is where a Merlin figure could emerge, This individual might be a genuine practitioner of surviving Celtic or Romano-British pagan traditions. Perhaps a druid, though organized druidism was largely suppressed by the Romans. Folk beliefs and local practitioners undoubtedly persisted. A seer or a shaman skilled in herbal lore, divination, and rituals designed to ensure success in battle, good harvests, or the fertility of the land and people. Their magic would be less about fireballs and transformations, and more about understanding natural cycles, manipulating group psychology, and providing a spiritual framework that resonated with the people. The medical hardship angle here is that such a figure might also be the primary healer that remedies a mix of practical herbalism and ritualistic incantations, the only recourse for the sick and wounded. Alternatively, your Merlin could be a more overtly political advisor, perhaps an educated Romano-Briton, literate in Latin, possessing knowledge of history, Roman military tactics, or diplomacy, who uses this learning to guide the warlord. Their magic would be the power of knowledge and strategic thinking in an increasingly fragmented world. They might help craft alliances, interpret events through a historical or pseudo-prophetic lens, and generally enhance the warlord's reputation for wisdom and foresight. One quirky yet plausible theory is that the Merlin figure, or aspects of his legend, might have been deliberately cultivated by the warlord himself as a form of propaganda. By associating himself with a powerful, mysterious, and seemingly supernaturally gifted advisor, your leader could enhance his own legitimacy, inspire awe and fear in his followers and enemies, and create an aura of destiny around his rule. Stories of Merlin's prophecies validating the warlord's actions could be a powerful tool for maintaining control. The scholarly debate around Merlin's origins is vast, with connections made to Welsh figures like Myrddin a legendary prophet and wild man of the woods. The shocking secret is that even if a Merlin advisor existed, his power likely stemmed not from actual sorcery, but from a potent combination of genuine wisdom, be it herbal, political, or spiritual, keen psychological insight, a deep understanding of existing folk beliefs, and perhaps a talent for theatricality and mystification. He would have been a crucial asset to any Dark Age warlord, providing counsel, spiritual sanction, and a vital link to the older, deeper currents of belief that still flowed strongly in sub-Roman Britain. His magic was the magic of influence, knowledge, and the manipulation of perception in a world desperate for answers and strong leadership. The romantic legends of King Arthur are rich with mystical elements, and few are as iconic as the Lady of the Lake, the ethereal figure who bestows upon Arthur his magical sword, Excalibur, from the watery depths, and to whom it is returned upon his death. It's a powerful, evocative image, but as you, the seeker of gritty historical truths, delve into the beliefs of Dark Age Britain, you uncover a shocking secret. This mythical lady might be a distant, Christianized echo of far more ancient and perhaps far more gory, or at least primal, pre-Roman British traditions involving water deities and ritualistic weapon depositions. Imagine yourself not in a medieval court, but in the wild, fenny landscapes of pre-Roman or sub-Roman Britain. Water, rivers, lakes, bogs, springs, was often seen not just as a physical resource, but as a sacred threshold, a gateway to the other world, the realm of powerful spirits and deities. For centuries, even millennia, Before Arthur, Celtic, and other indigenous European cultures had a widespread practice of depositing valuable objects, particularly weapons like swords, spears, and shields, into watery places. These were not accidental losses, they were deliberate, ritual offerings. You can almost feel the solemnity of such an act. A warrior casting his prized sword into the dark, still waters of a sacred mere, perhaps as an offering for victory, a tribute after a successful battle, or a way of committing a powerful, ritually charged object to the gods. Archaeology provides compelling evidence for this. The documentary you studied mentioned the Witham Valley in eastern England, where literally hundreds of swords, daggers, and other precious metal items, ranging in date from the Bronze Age through the Iron Age, and even into the Roman and later periods, have been dredged from rivers and fens, often near ancient causeways or trackways that crossed these watery landscapes. This wasn't just a localized cult. It was a widespread and long-lived tradition across much of Britain and Celtic Europe. The human endurance here is the endurance of a belief system, a set of rituals practiced for generation after generation. So, how does this connect to Arthur's Lady of the Lake? The scholarly debate suggests that as Britain was gradually Christianized, these powerful ancient pagan traditions didn't simply vanish overnight. Instead, they were often subtly absorbed, reinterpreted, or transformed within a Christian framework. The local water deities, the powerful female spirits or goddesses associated with sacred lakes and springs, might have evolved in folklore into figures like the Lady of the Lake. The act of a sword emerging from or returning to the water, once a pagan ritual offering, could have been woven into the new heroic narratives of a Christian king like Arthur, imbuing him with a sense of ancient, mystical legitimacy. One quirky tidbit is that many of these ritually deposited weapons, especially from the Iron Age, were often deliberately bent or broken before being cast into the water, an act known as ritual killing of the object, perhaps to release its spirit or to render it unusable in the human world, thus making it a true offering to the otherworldly powers. The medical hardship aspect is more metaphorical here. The death of paganism was a long, slow process, with its beliefs often leaving phantom limbs in later folklore. The shocking secret of the Lady of the Lake, then, is that this seemingly unique and magical element of the Arthurian legend may have its roots in ancient, deeply ingrained pagan practices that survived, transformed into the Christian era. Excalibur's mystical origins might be a sanitized, romanticized memory of a time when swords were given not to kings by magical ladies, but to powerful unseen water gods by anxious warriors. The image of King Arthur often involves grand feasts, noble quests, and moments of wise judgment from a secure throne. But if you were to experience the daily reality of a 5th or 6th century British warlord, the proto-Arthur figure we are exploring, you'd find a shocking secret. His life was an unceasing, exhausting grind, a relentless cycle of vigilance, resource management, and brutal politicking, with little room for rest or romance. This wasn't a life of leisure punctuated by adventure. It was a constant struggle for survival and dominance. Imagine your day as this warlord. You wake before dawn in your smoky, fortified timber hall, not to the sound of minstrels, but to the restless stirring of your warriors, the lowing of cattle within the ramparts, or perhaps the urgent report of a scout. Your first thoughts are not of courtly love or philosophical conundrums, but of security. Are the defenses sound? Are the sentries alert? Are there any signs of enemy movement in the surrounding territory? The threat of a surprise raid from rival British chieftains or encroaching Saxons is ever present. A moment of laxity could mean annihilation for you and your people. This constant underlying tension is a medical hardship in itself, a recipe for chronic stress. Your day is consumed by practical matters. You must ensure your warband, the very foundation of your power, is fed, armed, and reasonably content. This means overseeing the distribution of stored food, grain, salted meat, checking on the state of weapons and armor, likely simple leather and wood with metal being precious, and perhaps settling disputes among your often unruly followers. You might spend hours in council with your most trusted warriors, not around a polished round table, but perhaps on rough benches discussing strategies for an upcoming raid, the loyalty of a neighboring chieftain, or how to extract more tribute from a reluctant village under your control. The gory history is never far away. Decisions made here often lead directly to bloodshed. There are no vast bureaucracies to manage your territory. You rely on a small group of loyal retainers. You personally might have to inspect fortifications, judge disputes between your subjects, your justice likely swift and harsh, or even lead a hunting party if food stores are low. The human endurance required is immense, not just physical, but mental and emotional. You must project an aura of strength and confidence at all times, even when racked by doubt or fear. Any perceived weakness could be an invitation for a challenge to your authority, either from within your own warband or from an outside rival. One quirky detail of this daily grind is the constant need for information. In a world without newspapers or reliable long-distance communication, you depend on scouts, spies, and travelers for news of what's happening beyond your immediate borders. Is a rival warlord gathering forces? Are the Saxons on the move? Is there a new leader emerging who might threaten your alliances? This intelligence is vital for your survival. The scholarly debate often considers how these Dark Age leaders managed to control and administer even relatively small territories with such limited resources and communication. The shocking secret of your Dark Age warlord's daily life is its sheer, unremitting pressure. There are no peaceful interludes, no secure moments of leisure. Every decision is fraught with risk, every day a fresh battle against internal dissent, external threats, and the ever-present specter of starvation or betrayal. This is not the life of a king ruling by divine right from a secure castle. It's the precarious existence of a strong man clinging to power through constant effort, vigilance, and a willingness to engage in brutal pragmatism. Sleep, when it comes, is likely fitful, one ear always listening for the sound of alarm. The legend of King Arthur, in its most famous forms, culminates in a tragic, dramatic end. The Battle of Camelot, a catastrophic clash against his treacherous son or nephew, Mordred, where Arthur, though victorious, receives a mortal wound. His body is then spirited away to the mystical Isle of Avalon, to be healed and to await a time when Britain will need him again. The once and future king. It's a powerful, poignant myth. But as you, the seeker of the gritty truth behind the legend, consider the likely fate of a real 5th or 6th century British warlord, a far less romantic and perhaps more shocking secret emerges. The fall of such a figure was unlikely to involve magical islands or prophecies of return. it was far more likely to be a brutal, mundane affair of betrayal, military defeat, sickness, or simply fading into obscurity as a new strongman rose to prominence. Imagine your Dark Age proto-Arthur. He has carved out a small domain through years of relentless warfare, cunning alliances, and ruthless decisions. But power in this era is notoriously unstable. His fall could come in many forms. Perhaps he is finally defeated in battle by a more powerful rival, another British chieftain, or an ascendant Anglo-Saxon king. In the gory history of Dark Age warfare, defeat often meant death on the field, or capture and execution. There would be no chivalrous ransom, no honorable imprisonment. His warband would be scattered, his territory absorbed, his name perhaps cursed or deliberately forgotten by the victors. Betrayal from within his own ranks was another constant threat. A trusted lieutenant, an ambitious son, or a disgruntled faction within his warband might see an opportunity to seize power, assassinating him in his sleep or during a supposedly secure moment. Such internal power struggles were endemic in these fragmented societies. The human endurance of constantly watching your back, of never fully trusting even your closest companions, would be immense. Or perhaps the fall was less dramatic, more a slow decline. Your warlord grows old, his strength wanes, his battlefield prowess diminishes. Younger, more vigorous rivals rise to challenge him. He might lose a series of skirmishes, his territory shrinks, his followers desert him for a more successful leader. He could die, not in a blaze of glory, but from a common illness, a festering wound from an old battle, or simply the accumulated wear and tear of a hard life. The medical hardship in this era meant that even a strong leader was vulnerable to diseases or infections that a modern person would easily survive. There would be no Avalon to spirit him away for magical healing. There would only be the harsh reality of a failing body in a world with primitive medicine. One quirky, or rather historically plausible scenario is that your Arthur simply faded into obscurity. He might have ruled a small territory for a number of years, achieved some local renown for his victories, and then, as political tides shifted and new powers emerged, his influence waned, his kingdom was absorbed, and his name was eventually forgotten, or survived only in fragmented local oral traditions, later to be picked up and magnified by imaginative storytellers. The scholarly debate often considers this fading away model as one of the most likely ends for many Dark Age chieftains whose names are now lost to us. The shocking secret of Arthur's fall, then, is its likely mundanity compared to the high drama of Camelot and Avalon. There were no magical barges, no weeping queens, no promise of a messianic return. For a real Dark Age warlord, the end was usually brutal and final, or a slow slide into irrelevance. The romantic legend of the sleeping king awaiting his kingdom's call is a powerful myth, a testament to the enduring human desire for hope and a savior figure. But it is almost certainly a later embellishment, a comforting fiction layered over a far harsher, more prosaic, and often more tragic historical reality. You've journeyed through the brutal realities of Dark Age Britain, a world far removed from the chivalric courts of Camelot. You've confronted the likelihood that any historical Arthur was more a ruthless warlord than a saintly king. This raises a profound question, a shocking secret of historical psychology. Why the deception? Why did this grim, pragmatic figure, if he existed at all, undergo such a profound transformation in legend, becoming the epitome of knightly virtue, a beacon of hope and justice? The answer lies not just in the mists of time, but in the enduring human need for heroes and the powerful role of storytelling in shaping national identity and cultural memory. Imagine Britain in the centuries after the supposed time of Arthur. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms have risen and fallen. The Vikings have raided and settled. Then, in 1066, the Normans conquer England, imposing a new French-speaking aristocracy. In this context of conquest and cultural change, the conquered peoples, both the Anglo-Saxons and the remaining Britons in Wales, Cornwall, and Brittany, might have felt a deep yearning for a symbol of past glory, a native hero who had successfully resisted invaders. This is where the shadowy figure of a 5th or 6th century British war leader, perhaps one who had achieved some notable victories against the early Saxon settlers, could be seized upon and magnified. The process was gradual. Early Welsh poems and chronicles, as we've seen, speak of a warrior Arthur, but it was Geoffrey of Monmouth in the 12th century, writing his History of the Kings of Britain for a Norman and Angevin audience, who truly elevated Arthur to the status of a great pan-British king and European conqueror. Geoffrey's motives were likely complex: to provide his Norman patrons with a glorious, if largely fabricated, history for their new kingdom, to flatter Welsh pride by celebrating a great British hero, and perhaps simply to tell a cracking good story. His work was a medieval bestseller, and it laid the foundation for the romantic Arthurian tradition. The human endurance here is that of a memory, however faint, being kept alive and then dramatically reborn. Then came the French Romance writers, like Chrétien de Troyes. They took Geoffrey's kingly Arthur and infused his court with the ideals of chivalry and courtly love that were fashionable in the aristocratic circles of 12th and 13th century France. This was a new kind of medical hardship for the original gritty warlord. He was being cured of his brutality, remade into a refined, sensitive, and often tragically flawed romantic hero. Lancelot, Guinevere, the Grail Quest. These elements, so central to our image of Arthur, were largely their invention, reflecting the values and preoccupations of their own time, not those of Dark Age Britain. One quirky tidbit is how different cultures and eras have continually reshaped Arthur to fit their own needs. For the medieval Welsh, he was a symbol of resistance against the English. For English kings like Edward I, he was a model of imperial ambition. For the Victorians, he became an embodiment of Christian gentlemanly virtue. Each age found in Arthur what it wanted to see. The scholarly debate examines how these evolving portrayals reflect changing social, political, and religious ideologies. The shocking secret, then, is that the romantic deception wasn't necessarily a deliberate, malicious plot to hide a brutal truth. Rather, it was an organic process of myth-making, driven by a deep-seated human need for inspiring narratives, for heroes who embody our highest ideals, especially in times of uncertainty or perceived decline. The figure of a Dark Age warlord, however successful he might have been in his own brutal terms, was perhaps too stark, too uncomfortable for later generations. So, he was polished, refined, and draped in the shining armor of chivalry, transformed into the King Arthur we know today. A powerful symbol, a timeless legend, but a figure whose historical reality, if any, remains tantalizingly, and perhaps permanently, obscured by the glittering mist of romance. As we continue to strip away the romantic veneer from the figure of Arthur and his supposed age, you confront a shocking secret that is perhaps more pervasive and insidious than any single act of warlord brutality. The true, gory history of Dark Age Britain was not primarily one of mythical beasts and magical duels, but the relentless, grinding reality of disease, famine, and widespread societal despair. These were the real dragons that any leader, any community, had to battle daily, and the medical hardship they imposed was immense and unrelenting. Imagine yourself living in a village in the 5th or 6th century Britain. The grand Roman sanitation systems, the aqueducts bringing clean water, the sewers carrying waste away, have fallen into disrepair in many areas. Clean water sources are often contaminated. Personal hygiene is a challenge. In these conditions, diseases like dysentery, typhoid, and other waterborne illnesses would have been rampant, sweeping through communities with devastating effect, particularly among the young and the elderly. There are no antibiotics, no understanding of germ theory. An outbreak of the bloody flux, dysentery, could decimate a household or an entire village, leaving a trail of agonizing death. Then, there's the ever-present threat of famine. With the decline of Roman agricultural organization and the disruption of trade routes, food security became incredibly precarious. A bad harvest, due to drought, flood, or blight, or the loss of stored grain to raiders or vermin, could quickly lead to widespread starvation. You see the signs of malnutrition not just on the bones exhumed by future archaeologists, but in the gaunt faces and listless bodies of your neighbors, your children. The human endurance required to survive such periods of hunger, to watch your loved ones weaken and die from lack of food, is almost unimaginable. People would have resorted to eating whatever they could find. Tree bark, roots, perhaps even things that were barely edible or slightly toxic, further compromising their health. Infectious diseases that we now consider preventable or treatable were major killers. Smallpox, measles, influenza. These would have swept through populations with no natural immunity or effective medical response. Tuberculosis was likely endemic. Leprosy, though perhaps less common, was a terrifying and socially isolating affliction. The medical care available, as we've discussed, was a mixture of herbal remedies, folk magic, and prayer. While some herbs might have offered symptomatic relief, they could not cure these serious infections. You might witness a healer performing a ritual, chanting incantations over a feverish patient, a desperate attempt to ward off the unseen forces believed to cause illness. One quirky, or rather, profoundly grim detail is the likely impact of endemic warfare on public health. Displacement of populations, the destruction of crops and stored food, the breakdown of social order. All these consequences of conflict create ideal conditions for the spread of disease and the exacerbation of malnutrition. A village weakened by hunger and sickness is also an easier target for raiders, creating a vicious cycle of violence and deprivation. The shocking secret of Dark Age Britain's gory history is this pervasive attritional suffering. The heroic quests of Arthurian legend, with their focus on individual valor and monstrous foes, often obscure this far more mundane, yet far more deadly, reality faced by ordinary people. The true monsters were often invisible. The bacteria, the viruses, the relentless gnawing of hunger, and the chilling despair of a world where life was short, brutal, and profoundly uncertain. You've journeyed through the romantic myths of Arthur, confronted the brutal realities of Dark Age warlords, and shivered at the pervasive, gory history of disease and despair that truly defined the era. Now, as our exploration nears its end, let's turn to the cold, hard evidence, the shocking secrets unearthed by archaeologists, to see what tangible clues they offer about this shadowy period and the elusive figure of Arthur. While archaeology rarely provides definitive answers to questions of individual identity, from so long ago, it can paint a vivid picture of the world in which such a figure might have lived and fought. Consider Cadbury Castle in Somerset, that massive Iron Age hill fort we touched upon. Excavations there in the mid-20th century, famously led by Leslie Alcock, revealed significant refortification and high-status occupation during the 5th and 6th centuries AD, precisely the Arthurian period. They found evidence of a great timber hall, imported Mediterranean pottery, suggesting long-distance trade and a wealthy, powerful occupant, and even a gatehouse structure. You can almost feel the buzz of excitement among the diggers as these finds emerged. Was this the real Camelot? While Alcock himself was cautious, the popular imagination certainly seized upon the idea. The human endurance evident in refortifying such a massive site in a period of supposed collapse is remarkable. Then there's Tintagel Castle in Cornwall, a dramatic headland site steeped in Arthurian legend as his supposed birthplace, thanks to Geoffrey of Monmouth. Archaeological excavations there have also revealed the significant activity in the 5th and 6th centuries, including more evidence of imported Mediterranean pottery and glassware, indicating it was an important trading post with connections to the Byzantine world. This doesn't prove Arthur was born there, but it does show that this remote corner of Britain was not an isolated backwater during the Dark Ages, but part of a wider network of exchange. The medical hardship might be inferred from the rugged coastal environment and the dangers of sea trade. The scholarly debate rages around the interpretation of such sites. Does high-status occupation at a fortified site like Cadbury point to a single, powerful leader unifying large parts of Britain and Arthur? Or does it simply reflect the rise of numerous local and regional chieftains, each controlling their own territory, of whom, and Arthur, might have been just one, perhaps more successful or memorable than others? Archaeology can show us the what, the structures, the artifacts, the evidence of diet and trade, but the who and the precise why often remain elusive. One quirky yet significant archaeological aspect is the lack of certain types of evidence. For instance, there's a general scarcity of coinage and new monumental stone building from this period compared to the Roman era, which contributes to the Dark Age label. However, this doesn't necessarily mean a complete collapse of sophistication, but rather a shift in economic systems and social priorities. Perhaps wealth was expressed differently, or power was more decentralized. The shocking secret that archaeology reveals is often one of complexity and regional variation, a picture far more nuanced than the simple narratives of either total collapse or a single heroic king. It tells a story of adaptation, resilience, and the emergence of new forms of society and power in the wake of a crumbling empire. The stones and sherds don't always name kings, but they speak volumes about the world they inhabited. Our journey into the shadowy world of post-Roman Britain, seeking the truth behind the King Arthur deception, is now drawing to a close. You have peered through the mists of medieval romance, confronted the likely reality of a brutal Dark Age warlord, and understood the true gory history of an era defined by chaos, disease, and a desperate struggle for survival. The shocking secrets were not of dragons and sorcery, but of human fallibility, ruthless pragmatism, and the immense medical hardship and human endurance required to simply exist. What emerges is a stark contrast. The legendary Arthur, a paragon of chivalry, justice, and Christian virtue, versus the probable historical figure, if one existed, who would have been a hard-bitten, pragmatic war leader, his hands stained with the blood of countless battles, his rule maintained by force and fear as much as by loyalty. This was a man forged in the crucible of a collapsing civilization, a leader who did what was necessary to carve out a space for his people, or at least for his own power, in a brutal and unforgiving world. His Camelot was likely a reoccupied hill fort, his round table a council of grim-faced warriors, his magic the brutal efficiency of his warband. So why did this transformation occur? Why did the memory of a possible, ruthless warlord morph over centuries into the image of a sleeping king, a messianic figure destined to return in Britain's hour of need? The answer lies in the enduring power of myth, the human need for heroes, and the way societies reshape their past to serve the needs of the present. As Britain evolved through Anglo-Saxon invasions, Viking raids, and the Norman conquest, the figure of Arthur became a potent symbol of lost British glory, of resistance against invaders, of idealized Christian kingship, of national identity. Each era added its own layers, its own interpretations, until the gritty Dark Age reality was almost entirely obscured by a shimmering cloak of romance and legend. As you now allow these images of clashing swords, smoky hill forts, and whispered legends to soften and fade, as the stark realities of that ancient, violent world recede, find comfort in the peace of your own time. The quest to understand the real Arthur is perhaps less about finding a single historical person and more about understanding the deep human needs that gave birth to and sustained his extraordinary legend. The deception, if we can call it that, was not a malicious lie, but a collective act of storytelling, a way of finding meaning, hope, and inspiration in a fragmented and often terrifying past. Let the sounds of battle give way to the gentle rhythm of your breath. Let the shadows of the Dark Ages be replaced by the comforting darkness of your room. The warlords and their struggles are long dust. What remains is the power of their stories, however transformed, to still speak to us across the centuries. Allow your mind to release the turmoil of that ancient world and to embrace the quiet, restorative peace of the present moment, drifting now into a deep and untroubled sleep.